which, "You should have never come," my daughter-in-law said loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. And that was the moment I realized I was no longer welcome in my own family. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, my hand still resting lightly on the edge of the table, as if I needed something solid to remind me where I was. The soft clink of silverware from nearby tables continued, but quieter now, like the room itself had taken a step back. I had spent nearly an hour getting ready for that dinner, choosing a navy blue dress I hadn't worn in years, the one my late husband used to say made me look elegant without trying too hard. I even redid my hair twice, smoothing down the silver strands until they fell just right against my shoulders. It was just a dinner, I told myself earlier that evening. Just a chance to sit across from my son again, to hear about his work, to ask about my granddaughter's school play. Nothing complicated, nothing heavy, just family. When I arrived, the hostess looked at me with polite confusion, her tablet glowing faintly in her hands. "Are you with the Collins party?" she asked, glancing down at the reservation list. I smiled and nodded, though something in her hesitation lingered longer than it should have. "They're already seated," she said, gesturing toward the back of the dining room. I remember thinking it was odd they hadn't waited, but I brushed it off. People get busy. People get distracted. That's what I told myself as I walked toward their table. Ethan was already there, seated beside Jessica, his posture relaxed, his attention fixed somewhere just past me as I approached. He didn't stand. He didn't even look surprised to see me. Jessica, on the other hand, watched me the entire time, her expression unreadable, her lips pressed into a thin line that didn't quite qualify as a smile. "Oh," she said when I reached the table, her voice light but hollow. "You actually came." I laughed softly, thinking she was joking, and slid into the empty chair at the far end. No one had set a place for me, but a waiter quickly brought over utensils, his movements efficient, almost apologetic. I thanked him, smoothing my napkin across my lap, trying to ignore the subtle tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. The conversation that followed felt rehearsed. Jessica talked about a new project at work. Ethan nodded at the right moments, but neither of them asked me a single question. Not about my week. Not about how I'd been sleeping. Not even about the doctor's appointment I'd mentioned over the phone just days before. I told myself it was just one of those nights. Not every dinner had to be meaningful. Not every silence meant something was wrong. Then my plate arrived. I remember the smell first, grilled salmon, lightly seasoned, with a side of roasted vegetables. It looked perfect, untouched. I picked up my fork, my hand steady, and just as I was about to take my first bite, Jessica's voice cut through the air again, sharper this time. "I don't know why you're pretending this is normal," she said, setting her glass down a little too firmly. I looked up, confused, searching her face for some hint of humor, some sign that I had misunderstood. But there was none. Only irritation. Only something colder. "Jessica," I said quietly, "I'm not pretending anything. I just thought." "Exactly," she interrupted, her tone rising just enough to draw attention. "You thought. You always think you belong wherever you want." The words landed heavier than they sounded, like something rehearsed, something she had been waiting to say. I glanced at Ethan then, expecting him to step in, to soften the moment, to say something. Anything. But he just shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes fixed on the table, his silence louder than her voice. And then it happened. Jessica reached forward, not abruptly, not violently, but with a kind of deliberate finality, and nudged my plate off the edge of the table. It slipped, tilted, and landed on the floor with a dull, echoing sound that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Conversations nearby paused. A fork clinked against a glass somewhere to my left. I didn't look down at the mess. I didn't need to. "Which," she said again, softer now but somehow worse, because it felt closer, more personal. "You should have never come." For a moment, no one moved. Not the waiter. Not the people at the neighboring tables. Not even my son. I felt every eye in the room without turning my head to confirm it. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted, not shattered, not broken, just realigned. I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my untouched glass of water. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. "I see," I said, more to myself than to them. Then I stood up, smoothing the front of my dress as if I were leaving any other ordinary dinner. And for the first time that evening, I didn't feel confused. I felt certain. Whatever place I thought I still had at that table, it was gone long before I ever walked through that door. I did not look back at the table as I walked toward the exit. The carpet beneath my shoes felt softer than it had when I arrived, almost like the room was trying to swallow the moment whole before it could settle into memory. I passed the hostess stand again, and the young woman who had checked me in earlier offered a small, uncertain smile. I returned it, just enough to be polite, just enough to remind myself that not everyone in that room had chosen to hurt me. Outside, the evening air was cooler than I expected. It brushed against my face, carrying the faint scent of rain even though the sky was still clear. I paused on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me. No voices, no clinking glasses, no eyes watching. Just the low hum of passing cars and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I realized then that I was not trembling. Not from anger, not from embarrassment. If anything, I felt strangely steady, as though something inside me had already begun to reorganize itself into something quieter and more deliberate. I reached into my purse for my keys, my fingers moving automatically, and unlocked my car. The drive home took about 20 minutes, the same route I had taken countless times before, but everything along the way looked slightly different, like a photograph that had been shifted just enough to feel unfamiliar. The streetlights seemed brighter. The houses I passed felt more distant. Even the radio, which I had turned on out of habit, sounded hollow, so I switched it off and drove the rest of the way in silence. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a few seconds longer than usual, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The house in front of me looked exactly as it always had. The porch light was on. The curtains were drawn just enough to let a thin line of warm light spill onto the front steps. It was the same house I had shared with my husband for over 30 years, the same place where Ethan had grown up, where birthdays had been celebrated and holidays carefully planned. And yet, for the first time, it felt like a place that belonged entirely to me. No expectations attached, no roles to perform. I stepped inside and closed the door gently behind me. The quiet was immediate, but not heavy, just still. I set my purse on the kitchen counter, slipped off my shoes, and walked slowly into the living room. The lamp by the sofa was still on, casting a soft glow across the space. I must have left it that way when I rushed out earlier, too focused on being on time, too hopeful that the evening would be something worth remembering. I sat down, smoothing my dress absent-mindedly, and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The events of the night did not replay in my mind the way I expected them to. There was no loop of humiliation, no sharp sting of words echoing over and over again. Instead, there was a kind of clarity. Small details began to line up in a way they never had before. The missed phone calls that were never returned. The invitations that somehow stopped coming. The way conversations had become shorter, more transactional, as though I were someone to be managed rather than included. I thought about the hostess asking if I was with them, the hesitation in her voice, the way there had been no place set for me at the table. That had not been an oversight. That had been a decision. And I had walked straight into it, carrying a version of the past that no longer existed. I stood up after a while and made my way into the kitchen. The clock on the wall read a little past 9. I filled a glass with water and took a slow sip, letting the coolness ground me in the present. On the counter, near the edge where I had left it earlier, sat a small envelope. I had almost forgotten about it. It had arrived in the mail that afternoon, tucked between bills and advertisements, addressed in a familiar, careful handwriting that I had not seen in years. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The return address was simple, just a name I recognized immediately, someone my husband had trusted, someone he had once told me would always know what to do when things get complicated. I had meant to open it before I left for dinner, but I had been in a hurry, distracted by thoughts of reconciliation, of things going back to the way they used to be. I slid my finger carefully along the edge and opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, thicker than standard stationery, the kind people use when they want something to feel official. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes moving across the first few lines, and as I read, that same quiet certainty I had felt outside the restaurant returned, stronger this time, more defined. I lowered myself into the chair at the kitchen table, the paper still in my hands, and for the first time that evening, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to form. Not from satisfaction, not from vindication, but from understanding. Whatever had just happened at that dinner was not the beginning of something falling apart. It was the moment everything finally made sense. I read the letter twice before I allowed myself to fully understand it, not because the words were complicated, but because of what they implied. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady and precise, just as I remembered from years ago when my husband used to sit at the kitchen table late at night, reviewing documents, making notes, always planning 2 steps ahead of everyone else. He had trusted very few people when it came to financial matters, but the name at the bottom of that letter was one he had never questioned. "If anything ever feels off," he used to say, almost casually, as if it were not something that would ever truly happen, "you call him first." I had nodded at the time, more out of habit than concern, because back then, nothing ever felt off. Life had been predictable in the best way. Stable. Safe. Now, sitting alone at the same table, the letter resting lightly in my hands, I realized that he had not been speaking about that version of our life. He had been preparing me for this one. The letter itself was brief, almost restrained. It referenced documents I had never seen, accounts I had never managed, and a structure that had been put into place quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention. There was no urgency in the tone, no alarm, just a simple suggestion that I should come in and review everything in person. "At your earliest convenience," it said, as though the timing did not matter, as though this had been waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. I folded the paper carefully and set it down on the table, my fingertips resting on it for a second longer than necessary. Earlier that evening, I had walked into a restaurant believing I was still part of something, that I still had a place at a table that had once been mine by default, not by invitation. Now, that illusion had been removed so completely that there was nothing left to question. And in its place, there was something else. Not anger, not even hurt in the way I might have expected. It was closer to clarity, the kind that settles in slowly and does not leave room for doubt. I stood up and moved toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the framed photographs that lined the wall. There was one of Ethan at 8 years old, grinning widely with a missing front tooth, his arm wrapped tightly around my waist. Another from his college graduation, his cap tilted slightly to one side, his expression proud, hopeful. I traced the edge of the frame lightly with my finger, remembering the boy he had been, the one who used to run into the house after school and call out for me before he even set his backpack down. That version of him felt distant now, not gone entirely, but buried beneath years of choices I had not fully seen until tonight. I did not linger there long. Memories have a way of softening things that should remain sharp, and I needed to keep this moment clear. Back in the kitchen, I picked up the letter again and walked over to the counter where I kept my calendar. Tomorrow was open, completely empty. No appointments, no obligations, nothing that required my attention. For the first time in a long while, that did not feel like loneliness. It felt like space. Space to move, to think, to act without having to consider anyone else's expectations. I wrote down a single note in the corner of the page, just a name and a time, and underlined it once. Then I closed the calendar and set it aside. The house remained quiet around me, but it was no longer the kind of quiet that follows disappointment. It was steady, intentional. I turned off the kitchen light and made my way toward the bedroom, the letter still in my hand. As I placed it on the nightstand, next to the book I had been reading earlier that week, I realized something that should have been obvious much sooner. The dinner, the words, the look on my son's face as he chose not to speak, none of it had been a sudden change. It had been building, piece by piece, decision by decision, until it finally reached a point where it could no longer be hidden behind politeness or routine. And now that it was visible, I did not need to fix it. I only needed to decide what I was going to do next. I turned off the lamp and lay down, the room settling into darkness around me. Sleep did not come immediately, but that was not unusual. What was different was the absence of questions. There was no wondering how things could be repaired, no rehearsing of conversations that would never happen the way I imagined. There was only a quiet, steady understanding that whatever came next would not be about holding on to what had already been let go. It would be about something else entirely. And for the first time that night, that thought did not feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something I had not allowed myself to consider before. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere urgent to be, but because my mind had already moved ahead of the day. The house was still quiet, the kind of quiet that exists just before the sun fully rises, when everything feels suspended for a moment between what was and what is about to begin. I sat at the edge of the bed for a few seconds, letting my feet rest on the floor, grounding myself in the present before I stood up. The letter was still on the nightstand, exactly where I had placed it the night before, its presence steady and unchanged, unlike everything else that had shifted around me. I picked it up again, not to reread it, but simply to confirm that it was real, that what it represented had not been something I imagined in a moment of exhaustion. It was still there, solid, certain. I carried it with me into the kitchen, setting it beside the coffee maker as I began my usual routine. The familiar sounds of water filling the pot and the quiet hum of the machine felt almost comforting, a reminder that some things still followed a predictable rhythm. I poured myself a cup and stood by the window, watching as the light slowly stretched across the yard. For years, mornings like this had been filled with small expectations. Calls to make, plans to confirm, people to consider. Today, there was only one thing that mattered, and it did not require me to ask for anyone's approval. By the time I finished my coffee, I had already made up my mind. I changed into something simple but neat, a light gray blouse and dark slacks, the kind of outfit that did not draw attention but still carried a sense of intention. Before leaving, I paused in the hallway once more, my eyes briefly landing on the photographs I had passed the night before. This time, I did not stop. There was nothing left in those images that I needed to hold on to in order to move forward. The drive to the office took a little over 15 minutes, just across town, in a building I had passed countless times without ever needing to go inside. It stood quietly among a row of similar structures, understated but well-maintained, the kind of place where serious things were handled without unnecessary display. I parked near the entrance and sat in the car for a moment, not out of hesitation, but to take in the shift I was about to step into. Then I turned off the engine and walked inside. The reception area was calm, the lighting soft, the air carrying a faint scent of paper and polished wood. A woman behind the desk looked up as I approached, her expression professional but not distant. I gave my name, and there was no confusion this time, no hesitation. She nodded immediately, as if she had been expecting me, and asked me to take a seat while she notified him. That small difference did not go unnoticed. I sat down, placing my purse neatly beside me, my hands resting calmly in my lap. A few minutes later, a man stepped out from a hallway to the right. He was older than I remembered, his hair now completely gray, but his posture was the same, straight and composed, his presence steady in a way that felt familiar. "Martha," he said, his voice warm but measured, as if he understood exactly why I was there without needing to ask. I stood up and returned the greeting, offering a small smile that did not need to be forced. He led me into his office, closing the door gently behind us, and gestured for me to sit. The room was lined with shelves filled with neatly organized files, each one labeled with care, each one representing a piece of someone's life that had been entrusted to him. He took his seat across from me and placed a folder on the desk, his hands resting lightly on top of it. "I have been wondering when you might come in," he said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement of timing. I nodded once, reaching into my purse and placing the letter on the desk between us. "I believe it is time," I said simply. He glanced at the letter, then back at me, and for a brief moment, there was something in his expression that resembled recognition, not just of the situation, but of the shift that had brought me there. He opened the folder slowly, turning it so that I could see the contents, and as the first page came into view, I realized that whatever I thought I had lost the night before was only one part of a much larger picture, one that had been quietly waiting for me to step into it on my own terms. He did not rush through the explanation, and I appreciated that more than I expected. There was no sense of urgency in his voice, no attempt to overwhelm me with details I would not understand. Instead, he moved carefully, one page at a time, as if he had done this many times before for people who had arrived at the same quiet realization I had reached the night before. The first document he showed me was a summary, a clear outline of accounts, properties, and something he referred to as a structured trust. I recognized my husband's name immediately, followed by my own, listed not as an afterthought, but as the primary beneficiary. That alone made me pause. For years, I had assumed that everything we built together would naturally pass down to our son, that my role was simply to maintain what remained and eventually step aside. That was the understanding I had carried without ever questioning it. Now, seeing it written in precise, unmistakable language, I realized that my husband had never shared that assumption. He had planned differently. He was very intentional. The man across from me said, as if reading the shift in my expression. He wanted to make sure you would always have control over what you both created. Control. It was not a word I had associated with myself in a long time. I had spent years making decisions that revolved around other people, adjusting, accommodating, smoothing over situations so that everyone else remained comfortable. I nodded slowly, my eyes moving across the figures listed on the page. They were not small, not excessive, but substantial enough to represent a lifetime of careful planning and steady discipline. There were accounts I had never accessed, investments I had never monitored, all managed quietly under a structure that had been designed to activate fully only under certain conditions. Conditions that, I was beginning to understand, had now been met. There are also specific provisions, he continued, turning to another section of the folder. Your husband included guidelines regarding access and decision-making. In simple terms, no one can make changes or claim any part of these assets without your direct authorization. I let that settle for a moment. No one. The word echoed differently than I expected. It did not feel defensive. It felt definitive. And Ethan? I asked, not out of concern, but out of clarity. The question was necessary, not emotional. He met my gaze evenly. Your son has no automatic authority over any of this. Not now, and not in the future, unless you choose to grant it. There was no hesitation in his answer, no attempt to soften it. Just a fact, presented as plainly as everything else. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting on the edge of the desk as I absorbed what that meant. The dinner from the night before returned to my mind, not as a painful memory, but as a reference point. The empty place setting, the silence, the decision that had been made without me. And now, sitting here, I could see the contrast clearly. There, I had been excluded from something that once felt like mine. Here, I was being shown something that had always been mine, even when I did not realize it. There is one more thing, he added, reaching for a separate document. This one was more specific, more focused. This account has been used to cover certain expenses over the past few years. He turned it toward me, and I recognized the pattern almost immediately. Payments to vendors, transfers that aligned with renovations, travel arrangements, even the restaurant from the night before. The realization came quietly, without shock, because it fit too well with everything else I had already seen. They have been using this, I said, not as a question. He nodded once. Indirectly. It was structured in a way that made it accessible for household use, but still under the larger trust. I traced one of the entries with my finger, the date recent, the amount precise. I remembered Jessica mentioning a new project, a renovation, something about expanding their space. At the time, I had listened without asking how it was being funded. I had assumed it was not my place to question. That assumption no longer held. I withdrew my hand and sat back fully, the pieces aligning in a way that left no room for uncertainty. They had been building their version of stability using resources that were never truly theirs to control, and they had done so while slowly, deliberately removing me from the spaces where I might have noticed. I did not feel anger as that understanding settled in. What I felt was something much more useful. Awareness. What are my options? I asked, my voice calm, steady, as if I had been preparing to ask that question for far longer than just this morning. He closed the folder gently, his expression composed. You have more than most people realize, he said. The question is not what you can do. It is what you decide to do. And for the first time since I walked into that restaurant, I understood that the answer to that question did not depend on anyone else. I did not answer him immediately, not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to understand the full weight of the question before I spoke. For years, my decisions had been shaped by habit, by the quiet expectation that I would always choose what kept the peace, what avoided conflict, what made things easier for everyone else. Now, sitting across from him, with every document laid out in front of me, I realized that this was the first time in a very long time that I was being asked to choose something without that pressure. I looked back down at the folder, at the numbers, the names, the structure that had been carefully built long before I ever thought I would need to rely on it. My husband had not been impulsive. He had not been emotional when it came to these things. Every detail had been deliberate, every condition placed for a reason. And somewhere in that planning, he had anticipated a moment like this, even if I had not. I do not want to rush anything, I said finally, my voice even, steady in a way that surprised me. But I also do not want things to continue the way they have been. He nodded, as if that was exactly the kind of answer he expected. That is a reasonable place to start, he replied. There are steps we can take that do not require immediate confrontation. That word again, confrontation. It sounded heavier than what I had in mind. I was not interested in arguments or explanations that would be dismissed before they were fully heard. What I wanted was clarity, structure, something that could not be twisted or reinterpreted depending on who was speaking. What would those steps look like? I asked. He opened the folder again, this time turning to a section that outlined access permissions and account controls. We can begin by reviewing and adjusting how these accounts are used, he explained. At the moment, there is indirect access that allows certain expenses to be processed without your direct approval. That can be changed. Changed. It was a simple word, but it carried a quiet sense of finality. And they would notice? I asked, not out of concern for their reaction, but to understand the sequence of events. Eventually, he said, not immediately. It depends on how frequently they rely on those funds. I thought about the list I had seen, the steady pattern of usage, the assumption behind it. They had not been cautious. They had not needed to be. From their perspective, there had been no reason to question where the resources came from or who ultimately controlled them. That was the part that stayed with me. Not the use itself, but the certainty behind it. The belief that nothing would change. I would like to begin there, I said, lifting my eyes to meet his. Quietly, he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the decision without adding anything unnecessary. We can also arrange for a full review of all recent transactions, he continued. It would give you a clearer picture of how everything has been managed. I nodded once. That felt necessary. Not because I needed evidence to justify what I already understood, but because I wanted to see it in its entirety, without gaps, without assumptions. Do that as well, I said. He made a brief note, his pen moving quickly across the page, then set it aside. There is one more consideration, he added, his tone shifting just slightly, becoming more precise. If you choose to make broader changes later, it may be helpful to have documentation prepared in advance. Not to act on immediately, but to ensure you are not reacting under pressure. I understood what he meant. This was not just about adjusting accounts or reviewing numbers. It was about preparing for the moment when those changes would be noticed, when questions would be asked, when the balance that had been quietly assumed would no longer exist. I took a slow breath, letting that settle. Prepare whatever you think is necessary, I said. I would rather have it and not need it than the other way around. He gave a small, approving nod, then closed the folder once more. Very well, he said. We will proceed carefully. Carefully. That was a word I understood. Not hesitant, not fearful, but deliberate. I stood up then, smoothing my blouse out of habit, though there was nothing to adjust. The room felt different than when I had walked in, not because anything had changed physically, but because I had. The uncertainty that had followed me the night before had been replaced with something far more stable. Direction. As I reached for my purse, he stood as well, walking me to the door. If anything comes up, he said, you can contact me directly. I nodded, offering a small, genuine smile. I will. When I stepped back into the reception area, everything looked the same as before. The same desk, the same soft lighting, the same quiet order. But as I walked toward the exit, I realized that I was no longer carrying the same version of myself that had entered. Outside, the air felt warmer now, the sun higher in the sky, the day fully in motion. I paused for just a second before heading to my car, not to hesitate, but to take note of the shift that had already begun. Whatever happened next would not be loud. It would not be dramatic. It would unfold the same way everything important in my life had always unfolded. Quietly, and with purpose. The first change happened 3 days later, and it did not come with any announcement. I was in my kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in my hand, when my phone buzzed softly against the surface. I glanced at the screen without urgency, expecting something routine, but the name that appeared made me pause for just a moment. It was Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering, not to create distance, but because I wanted to meet the moment without rushing into it. "Good morning," I said, my tone even, as if nothing had shifted between us. There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind that comes when someone is trying to decide how to begin. "Mom," he said finally, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty I had not heard from him in years. "Did you change something with the accounts?" I did not respond immediately. Instead, I set my cup down carefully and leaned lightly against the counter, letting the question settle in the space between us. "What makes you ask that?" I replied, not as a challenge, but as a way to understand how much he already knew. Another pause. Longer this time. "There were a few transactions that did not go through," he said. "Jessica noticed it this morning. We thought it might be a system error." I could picture it clearly without needing to be there. The confusion first, then the quick assumption that something external must have caused it. Not a decision, not a change in control, just an inconvenience to be resolved. "It is not a system error," I said calmly. I kept my voice steady, measured, the same way I had spoken in the office a few days earlier. I asked for a review of the accounts. There was a shift on the other end, subtle but unmistakable. "A review?" he repeated, as if the word itself needed clarification. "Why?" The question was direct, but it did not carry anger yet. Just confusion. I looked out the window, watching as a car passed slowly down the street, its movement unhurried, unaffected by anything happening inside my home. "Because I had never seen them before," I said, and I thought it was time that I did. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Less uncertain, more guarded. "We have been managing things just fine," he said after a moment, his tone tightening slightly. There was no need to change anything. I let that statement sit for a second, not because I needed to consider it, but because I wanted him to hear the weight of his own assumption. "Managing what exactly?" I asked gently, not confrontational, not sharp, just clear. He did not answer right away. I could almost hear the calculation behind the silence, the realization that the conversation was no longer moving along the path he expected. "The house, the expenses, everything," he said finally. "It has all been taken care of." I nodded, even though he could not see me. "Yes," I said. "It has." I did not add anything more to that sentence. I did not need to. The meaning was already there. The difference between being taken care of and taking control is something people rarely notice until it is pointed out. "So what does this mean?" he asked, and now there was something else in his voice. Not just confusion, not quite frustration, something closer to concern. I turned away from the window and walked slowly toward the table, resting my hand lightly on the back of the chair. "It means I am looking at everything more closely," I said. "That is all." That was not all, of course, but it was enough for now. Enough to shift the ground beneath assumptions that had gone unquestioned for too long. "Jessica is going to want to talk about this," he said, the name coming into the conversation like a second voice, even though she was not there. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I am sure she will," I replied. There was a pause, shorter this time, as if he was waiting for me to say something else, to explain, to justify, to reassure him that nothing fundamental had changed. I did not. Finally, he exhaled quietly. "We will figure this out," he said, though it sounded more like something he was telling himself than me. "Yes," I said softly. "We will." I ended the call shortly after that, not abruptly, but without extending it beyond what was necessary. When the line went silent, I set the phone down on the table and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness return. Outside, the day continued as it always did. Inside, something had already shifted, quietly but unmistakably. They had noticed. Not everything, not yet, but enough to feel the change. And this time, I was not reacting to what they chose to do. I was deciding what came next. They did not wait long to follow up. The next call came later that afternoon, this time not from Ethan, but from Jessica. I recognized the number immediately, though she rarely called me directly. For a brief moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, not out of avoidance, but because I already understood the purpose behind it. Still, I answered before the second ring ended. "Martha," she said, skipping any form of greeting, her voice composed but carrying a tight edge beneath the surface. "We need to talk." I moved slowly toward the living room, taking a seat in the same chair I had sat in the night before, the one facing the window. "We are talking," I replied calmly. There was a slight pause, as if she had expected resistance, not stillness. About the accounts, she continued, her tone sharpening just enough to reveal the pressure behind it. Something is wrong. Payments are being delayed, and we have obligations that need to be handled. I let her finish without interrupting, listening not just to the words, but to the structure of them. Not a question, not a request. A statement framed as urgency. I am aware, I said. I requested the changes. The silence that followed was brief, but it held more weight than anything she had said so far. You requested them? She repeated, her voice tightening. Why would you do that without discussing it with us? There it was. The assumption, laid out plainly. The expectation that I would consult them before making a decision about something that had never belonged to them in the first place. I rested my hands lightly on my lap, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice steady. Because it is not something that requires discussion, I said. Not harsh, not defensive, just clear. She exhaled, not quite a sigh, more like a controlled release of frustration. Martha, we have been handling these finances for years, she said, her words carefully chosen now, each one placed with intention. There is a system in place. Disrupting it like this affects more than just a few transactions. I looked out the window as she spoke, watching the light shift slightly as the afternoon moved forward. I understand that, I replied. That is why I am reviewing everything. Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear the recalibration happening on the other end, the shift from assumption to strategy. If there are concerns, she said more slowly, we can go over them. Together. There is no reason to make sudden changes. I allowed a small moment of silence before answering, not to create tension, but to give space for the words to settle. The changes are not sudden, I said. They are simply the first step. The line went quiet again, and this time, the silence felt different. Not uncertain, not questioning, measured. What exactly are you implying? She asked, her tone now controlled, but with a sharper edge beneath it. I did not answer the question directly, not because I could not, but because I did not need to. I am not implying anything, I said. I am making decisions. There was a shift then, subtle but undeniable. The conversation was no longer about confusion or inconvenience. It had moved into something else. Recognition. Ethan thinks this is just a review, she said after a moment, her voice lowering slightly. Is it? I let that question sit for a second, then answered it with the same calm certainty I had carried since leaving that office. It is exactly what I said it is, I replied. A review. I did not elaborate. I did not offer reassurance. I did not soften the edges. Because the truth did not need decoration. We should meet, she said, more firmly now. In person. This is not something that should be handled over the phone. I nodded slightly, though she could not see it. I agree, I said. That would be appropriate. Another pause. When? She asked. I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time without urgency. Soon, I said. I will let you know. It was a simple answer, but it shifted the control of timing completely. She did not respond immediately, and when she did, her voice had changed again, more careful, more contained. All right, she said. We will wait to hear from you. The call ended shortly after that, without any further attempts to press or persuade. When I set the phone down, the room returned to its quiet state, but it was not the same quiet as before. This one carried movement beneath the surface. They understood now, at least partially. The structure they had relied on was no longer invisible, no longer untouchable. And for the first time, they were not deciding how things would proceed. I was. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting the stillness settle again, and allowed myself a brief moment to consider the next step. Not as a reaction, not as a defense, but as a continuation of something that had already begun. Whatever came next would not be about explaining myself. It would be about showing them, in the clearest way possible, that the foundation they had taken for granted had never belonged to them to begin with. 2 days later, I called them back and suggested we meet for brunch on Sunday. I chose the place carefully, not for its elegance, but for its neutrality. A quiet restaurant with wide windows, soft lighting, and enough distance between tables to allow a conversation to unfold without becoming a spectacle. When I arrived, I was early, not because I needed the time, but because I wanted to sit in that space before they did, to settle into it on my own terms. I chose a table near the window and placed my purse neatly beside me, my hands resting calmly on the table as I waited. When Ethan and Jessica walked in together, I noticed the difference immediately. not in what they wore or how they carried themselves, but in the way they scanned the room before approaching me, as if they were stepping into something unfamiliar. Jessica reached the table first, offering a tight, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. Ethan followed a step behind, his expression more restrained, his gaze flickering briefly toward me before settling somewhere just past my shoulder. "Thank you for meeting us," Jessica said as they sat down, her tone controlled, measured. "Of course," I replied simply. There was no need to fill the space with anything more. The menus were placed in front of us, but no one opened them right away. The purpose of this meeting was already clear, and we all understood it. "We need to clarify what is happening," Jessica began, her voice steady, her posture upright. "The changes you made have already caused complications." I listened without interrupting, my attention steady, my expression neutral. "They were not complications," I said after she finished. "They were adjustments." Ethan shifted slightly in his seat, his hands coming together on the table as if he were trying to anchor himself in the conversation. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than hers, but carrying a quiet urgency. "If there is something we need to understand, you can just tell us. We do not need to go through all of this." I looked at him then, really looked at him, not as the boy in the photographs on my wall, but as the man sitting across from me now. "That is exactly what I am doing," I said. There was a brief silence, one that felt more intentional than uncertain. Then I reached into my purse and took out a folder, placing it gently on the table between us. I did not slide it toward them immediately. I simply rested my hand on top of it for a moment, allowing its presence to register. "I met with your father's advisor," I continued, my voice calm, even. "We reviewed everything. The accounts, the structure, the permissions." Jessica's expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the tension beneath her composure. "And?" she asked, her tone careful. I moved the folder forward then, positioning it so that both of them could see it clearly. "And I realized something important," I said. "These were never accounts that required your management." The words settled into the space between us with a quiet weight. Ethan's eyes moved to the folder, then back to me, his expression tightening as the meaning began to take shape. Jessica did not reach for it immediately. She held her position, her gaze steady, her mind working through the implications. "We were helping," she said finally, her voice controlled, but with a sharper edge beneath it. "Handling things that needed to be handled." I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. "Yes," I said. "You were using resources that were available." I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what was true. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly in his chair, as if the conversation had shifted beyond what he expected. "So what happens now?" he asked. I met his gaze directly, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with clarity. "Now," I said, "everything moves through me." There was no hesitation. In the sentence, no room for interpretation. Jessica's hand moved toward the folder then, her fingers resting lightly on its edge before she opened it. Her eyes moved quickly across the first page, then the next, her expression tightening as she recognized the structure, the names, the authority clearly outlined in language that could not be reinterpreted. "This changes things," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "Yes," I replied. "It does." The server approached then, asking if we were ready to order, his voice polite, unaware of the shift that had just taken place at the table. Jessica closed the folder slowly, her movements controlled, and placed it back down between us. "We will need time to go through this," she said, her tone measured, but no longer leading the conversation. I nodded once. "Take all the time you need," I said. "Nothing moves without my approval now." Ethan looked at me again, this time with something closer to understanding, though it had not fully settled yet. The dynamic had changed, not with force, not with confrontation, but with something far more difficult to ignore. Clarity. I reached for my glass of water, taking a small sip, my movement steady, unhurried. Around us, the restaurant continued as it always did, conversations rising and falling, plates being served, life moving forward without pause. But at that table, something had ended, and something else had taken its place. Not a victory, not a defeat, just the quiet, undeniable shift of control returning to where it had always belonged.